Of the Jewish Historical Society's Israel branch. Our speaker this evening, and we welcome for the first time, is Rabbi Meir Salasnik, who will tell us about the Chacham Tzvi, with a question, grandfather of the British Chief Rabbinate. I hope Rabbi Salasnik will forgive me if one or two of the details in this build-up or biography are not strictly correct, because I had to piece it together from various sources. We gather that he was born overseas, but grew up in London, where he... Born in London?
Well, from here it's overseas.
I was conceived in Jerusalem and born in London.
Well, interesting. Just show you the sources are going to be misleading.
More details.
Anyway, so I will correct that in the... He obtained a BA degree in history and was a fellow student of Emeritus Chief Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs at Jewish College, because Lord Sachs has memories of him at the time. As successively minister of the Notting Hill Synagogue, that was from 1970-74, of the Leytonstone and Wanstead Synagogue, 74-79, and finally of the Bushy United Synagogue from 1979, Rabbi Meir Salasnik endeared himself to people far beyond his immediate community through what Lord Sachs calls the great gifts of kindness, compassion, sensitivity, patience, and love. Under his leadership, Bushy grew to become the United Synagogue's fourth largest congregation. Over the years, he also held office as senior Jewish hospital chaplain, secretary of the Chief Rabbi's Cabinet, and chairman of the Rabbinical Council of the United Synagogue. In July 2016, Rabbi Salasnik was the subject of a This Is Your Life event at Watford's Coliseum Theatre. And upon his retirement in the following September, he was the longest-serving rabbi in any individual congregation of the US. When he and Rebbetzin Judith Salasnik, a much loved and inspiring educator, made Aliyah to join many of their children and grandchildren here, it was logical for them to settle in Jerusalem, where Rabbi Salasnik has important Yerushalmi roots. Furthermore, he is not only a keen student of Anglo-Jewish history, but an expert on mishpachology and Jewish family trees as well. So we now look forward to hearing his presentation on an intriguing related subject. Ladies and gentlemen, Rabbi Salasnik.
Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, first of all, thank you for the wonderful introduction, and everything you said about my wife was true. Now, I just want to mention our chairman actually was the inspiration for a different talk I gave. In Bushy, we had a group which was called Bushy Jig, Jewish Interest Group, which met once every 2 months. And about once every couple of years, I was a guest speaker. And so one year I chose to speak about my father's predecessors. And my father had been Rabbi in Walthamstow for about 35, 36 years, and he had a number of predecessors. And the only reason I was able to give this talk was actually thanks to our chairman. Because our chairman, who comes from Liverpool, once wrote about a man called Isaac Goller. This Isaac Goller was a man who was totally unfit for the ministry and really wanted to be a playwright. But he actually was, after having, shall we say, messed up several careers in the ministry, he found his métier in Liverpool as the leader of a youth synagogue.
Young Israel.
A young Israel, which was apparently very successful. In other words, relatively late in his life, unfortunately he died relatively young, but relatively late in his life he found what he should have been doing right from the start. And our chairman wrote so much about him that actually that was half my talk, and the other half of the talk was all the other people who had been my father's predecessors in Walthamstow. So, it's a pleasure to meet a number of relatives and friends some of whom I have not seen for 20 or even, in one case, for 45 years. So I now know where you are, and you now know where I am. About 50 or 60 years ago, the number of picture decorations for Sukkot were far fewer than they are now. There was one popular picture, which you may recall, of 20 leading rabbis, starting off with the Rif Rabbi Yitzchok Alfasi, going through Rashi, Ramban Nachmanides, Rambam Maimonides, right up to, I think, the Chassam Sofer. And they covered basically from the year 1000 to the year 1840. What I did not realize at the time was that while some portraits, for example those of Rashi and Rambam, were traditional but in no way definitive, and others were assumed to be correct, such as the portrait of the Vilna Gaon of the Baal Shem Tov, but were actually of other people, the portrait of the Chacham Tzvi was accurate. I've actually photocopied 5 or 6 of them in black and white, which are in different areas, so please feel free to look at them. Indeed, he is one of the few rabbis of over 300 years ago where an accurate image exists of him, and more about this later. What was the wider world into which Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Ashkenazi, the Chacham Tzvi, was born? And we're actually not even sure of his date. We know he died in 1718. It is generally assumed that he was born in 1660, but he might have actually been born 3 or 4 years earlier. So I've seen dates of 1656, 1658, and 1660. So what was the world like? So as we all know, less than 2 centuries before, the Jewish communities of Spain and Portugal had been expelled. By sheer force of numbers, they were to refashion the communities that they moved to. The various communities in Israel, Greece, and Southeast Europe that they moved to may have been small and very diverse communities, but in receiving a large immigration from Iberia, they became more similar. And within a relatively short time, Ladino was the common language of what became Sephardi Eastern Europe. Some, of course, remained in Iberia and converted to Christianity, pretending to be Christian, but keeping as much a Jewish life as they could. And when such people, having been brought up in a Christian world, made it to freedom and returned to the faith of their fathers, it was not always easy to fully return. Were they just going to take the Judaism of a written Torah, or which they had known something while pretending to be Catholic simply because there was a Bible? Or were they going to keep the Judaism of the Talmud and the Shulchan Aruch, knowledge of which was less known to them during their secret Marano existence? The middle of the 17th century was, of course, a time of upheaval throughout Europe, as basically British Jews, we are most familiar with the English Civil War and the execution of the king. But there were other revolutions as well. And the one that most impacted against the Jews was in Poland, the haven where they had their own Jewish Council of the Four Lands. And this was a massacre that dwarfed all other pogroms, perhaps excepting the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion, right until the 20th century itself, what we know as the Khmelnytsky massacres of 1648 to 9. And for the demoralized remnant of that Holocaust, there was, just 18 years later, a messianic figure called Shabbatai Tzvi, who appeared to gain more adherents than any other messianic pretender that there had been in the 15 centuries since Bar Kokhba. Only, of course, after a few months to convert to Islam under the threat of the Sultan in Constantinople. Basically, the Sultan, after observing the goings-on for several months of the Jews believing their Messiah had come, decided to invite this man. When he came, he said, "So you're the Messiah?" "Yes." "So when my archers shoot at you, nothing will happen." "Well, I'm not that sort of Messiah." "If you're not that sort of Messiah, you want to convert to Islam." "Is that my only choice?" "Yes, I'll convert to Islam." And while many realized that they had been duped, others kept faith. Some followed him into Islam, maintaining a religion that was part Muslim, part Jewish. We know them as the Don Men. And it was not always possible to distinguish as to who was a secret Sabbatean and therefore a heretic, and who was a believing Jew. The Chacham Tzvi would have been between the age of 6 and 10 at the time of the Shabbatai Tzvi's messianic visitation. He would have witnessed the euphoria and then the disappointment. He would have known people who were initially taken in and then rudely disappointed. And one of the questions he was to respond to many years later as a rabbi was one that came from a place called Candia, which we know as Crete, where one of the Chatanim chosen for Simchat Torah was a Jew who had joined Islam, had then realized his error and returned to Judaism. Presumably, this was a person who had followed Shabbatai Tzvi. And some of the congregation considered that this person's past disqualified him from being honored on Simchat Torah. Mr. Former President of the United Synagogue, I've never told you, but every now and again I would get people asking me why such and such a person was chosen as Chatan Torah or Chatan Beishit, but surely there were people far more appropriate for the position. And I would inform them that the honorary officers had made the choice and I'd only just rubber stamped. The Chatam Tzvi agreed with the choice, pointing out that as the gentleman had done to Shuvah, he is to be treated like every other Jew, and therefore he was appropriate to be, whether it was Chatan Torah or Chatan Beishit. The Chacham Tzvi was to remain a fighter against the Shabbatean heresy all his life, and according to the most famous of his children, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Chacham Tzvi's surname was Ashkenazi. His son, his older son Yaakov, however, is known as Yaakov Emden because of, I'm not sure whether he was actually born there or just that at some stage he lived there and was rabbi there and therefore got that surname. And according to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who wrote a autobiography which was translated by the late Rabbi Sidney Lepera, who many of you may recall, a lot is known, not just about Rabbi Yaakov Emden, but about his father, the Chacham Tzvi. And according to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, his father felt that the bracha which we say on weekdays in the Yamida, V'lam al shin ma'alti tikva, may there be, for the informers, may there be no hope. The Chacham Tzvi felt that in his generation, that bracha referred to the Sabbateans, to the people who follow Shabbatai Tzvi. Within Europe, there was the centuries-old conflict between Christendom and Islam. Now, that didn't immediately affect the Jews, but of course it did affect the Jews, because Jews were throughout Europe. They lived in Christian areas and they lived in Muslim areas. So when the battle was in their area, it affected them. And as I will later on mention, the Chacham Tzvi lost his first wife and daughter because of that war. In 1683 at Vienna, the Muslims were turned back, and from then until 1699, Christian Europe took back land from the Ottoman Empire, including Hungary, setting a pattern that would culminate much later in the defeat and dismantling of the Ottoman Empire just under 100 years ago, because Allenby still has to fight his battle in Damascus in August 1918, 100 years ago. And then in the 17th century, a new wind of science and toleration, tempering the religious intolerance of just a century before. Newton and Locke, and the invention of printing, which had been a couple of centuries before, but was of course improving, and that was enabling ideas to traverse borders, both geographical and of communities. This was to lead to an enlightenment that would bring emancipation for Jews, but also assimilation, albeit that such was more in the 18th century and beyond, in the generation of the Chacham Tzvi's children. And to add to all of this, the not infrequent controversies between rabbis, some of which characterized the Chacham Tzvi's life, although the most damaging were to be in the generation or two after him, including a controversy between his son Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Yonason Eibschutz over Rabbi Yaakov's suspicions that Rabbi Yonason was a secret Shabbatian. I once met somebody who was descended from Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and his wife was descended from Rabbi Yonason Eibschutz. And I asked him if his children were intellectually schizophrenic. To which he said, we made a decision that my ancestor was wrong and my wife's ancestor was right, and that's the way the children are able to cope. Every one of the aspects I've mentioned of Judaism in 17th century Europe affected the Chacham Tzvi's life or appear in the questions posed to him by communities around Europe. So, back to his life. He was born, as I already mentioned, sometime between 1656 and 1660 in Moravia, an area now in the Czech Republic. It's possible that the actual place of his birth was somewhere which I'm going to mispronounce as Velká Meseřice. His parents and maternal grandparents had actually come from Vilna. They were survivors of the Khmelnytsky massacres, and they had escaped south. His maternal grandfather, Ephraim ben Yaakov HaKohen, was famous as the author of Sha'ar Ephraim, which was actually his She'elot HaTshuvot, his responsa sefer, his reply to questions asked of him. The Chacham Tzvi's own father was known as Yaakov Zak, and therefore the Chacham Tzvi was therefore Tzvi ben Yaakov Zak. Later I will come back to the coincidental relevance of this name. Surnames were not obligatory in those times, and it is possible that Zak was simply an abbreviation of Zera Kodesh, holy seed, suggesting an ancestor who chose martyrdom rather than convert to Christianity. Later, the family moved from Moravia to Altofen, I probably mispronounced that as well, an area that we now know as part of Budapest, an area that was at that time within the Ottoman Empire. So he grew up within or close to a Muslim world. And it was not surprising that after being taught by both his father and grandfather, that he then moved to Salonika, to the yeshiva of Rabbi Eliyahu Kovo, to learn from the sages there. Rabbi Eliyahu Kovo was the author of another sefer called Aderet Eliyahu, which was his book of responsa. And it is possible that it is from there that the Chacham Tzvi became known as a Chacham, a title usually associated with Sephardi rabbis, while of course he was an Ashkenazi, both in ancestry and in surname. In 1676, aged between 16 and 20, he wrote his first responsa. After Salonika, he went to Belgrade, and he was also in Constantinople. So he spent several formative years among Sephardim. Then in 1680 he returned back home to Ofen. In 1686, the war between Christianity and Islam, which, as I already mentioned, in 1683 had kept Vienna Christian, came to Ofen. There was the Austrian-led European forces besieged the city. His wife and daughter, as I already mentioned, were killed by cannon shot. His parents were taken prisoner by a German Brandenburg regiment and later ransomed by the Jews of Berlin, although it was about 2 to 3 years before the Chacham Tzvi knew that they had survived. And so a widower with having lost his child as well, and for all he knew having lost his parents, he escaped Ofen and he went back to within the Ottoman Empire to Sarajevo, after that to Vienna and Prague, coming to Berlin to join his parents in 1689. And subsequently he married Sarah Rivka, a daughter of Rabbi Meshulam Zalman Neumark Mirels. Neumark Mirels seems to be hyphenated. The rabbi of the triple community of Altona, Hamburg and Wandsbek, a community that was in North Germany. Now, basically, of course, the main place was Hamburg, but Jews were not always allowed to live in Hamburg, and Wandsbek was one part of Hamburg, was one suburb of Hamburg, Altona was another suburb. Altona, my relative from Norway will be pleased to know that Altona was at one stage under Danish rule, and I think at that stage it was, at that time it was under Danish rule. So you had this community was partly German. Of course it wasn't called German yet because Germany doesn't yet exist as a country, but partly German, partly Danish. And the community, in common with Amsterdam and London, were well-off communities, relatively new, consisting of both Sephardi and Ashkenazi synagogues, the Sephardim having been invited to those port cities, as I said, Hamburg, Amsterdam, London, some from as early as the end of the 16th century, and of course in London, the middle of the 17th century. And in every case, one of the reasons was the trading connections that Sephardim had with the New World and elsewhere in Europe. And the Ashkenazim generally followed the Sephardim. In other words, once some Jews are let in, other Jews follow. I think I messed something up, yes. While in Altona for a number of years, possibly as much as 17, the Chacham Tzvi was not actually a community rabbi. He headed what was called the Klaus, which I suppose we would understand either as a yeshiva or kollel in Altona, which was founded and funded for him by the leaders of the community. And I'm aware there was at least one London Jew who was a benefactor to this Klaus. So in other words, although in Altona near Hamburg, it was nevertheless supported by Jews in other parts of Europe as well. In 1707, his father-in-law had died, and he succeeded him as rabbi. But it would not surprise you to know that whenever there's a rabbinic position available, there are people in the congregation who think that somebody else should be the rabbi. And some of the people wanted a Rabbi Moshe Rothenberg. And so an arrangement was made, which anybody who has been involved in shul life will know is going to be disastrous. One would be the rabbi for 6 months, and the other would be the rabbi for the alternative 6 months. Within 2 years, the Chacham Tzvi had resigned his position over the heartless chicken. What had happened was, a lady in her kitchen was koshering her chicken. And there wasn't a heart. Now, the servant girl said, the servant girl presumably was involved in cutting up the chicken. Don't worry, there had been a shochet. The servant girl was presumably cutting up the chicken, and the lady of the house couldn't find a heart. The servant girl said, no, nothing's dropped. So, obviously, there's a chicken without a heart. This is a shaila. So, any rabbi to whom this is taken says the chicken is treif. Because if it doesn't have a heart, it's not going to live for another year. If it doesn't live for another year, it's treif. The Chacham Tzvi must have had a greater knowledge in biology than the others. And he said, this is impossible. If it didn't have a heart, it wouldn't have lived in the first place. So, it wouldn't have, so therefore, it must have had a heart. It's just that the heart dropped. And had been brushed away, and that's what's happened. But the chicken had a heart, and if everything else is kosher, this chicken is kosher. Nevertheless, the atmosphere about this was such that the Chacham Tzvi decided he had enough and resigned his rabbinic position and retained or returned to his position as head of the class of the yeshiva or kollel. However, this did not last long, because in 1710 he was offered the post of Rabbi of the Ashkenazi community of Amsterdam. Now note, by the way, that how many major cities he has lived in for longer or shorter periods of time. It's almost the capitals of that area of Europe. Budapest, Salonika, Constantinople, Belgrade, Sarajevo, Prague, Vienna, Berlin, Hamburg, and now Amsterdam. Of course, he's not in Madrid or Lisbon simply because Jews are not welcome in Spain and Portugal. He doesn't go to France, it seems, but that's quite understandable as well, because the areas in which he lives are at war with France. Remember, he is he's almost an exact contemporary of Marlborough. Marlborough, during these years, Marlborough is in North Europe, fighting the French. King William III was the King of Holland, who became also the King of England. By now, King William has died, and Queen Anne is on the British throne, but nevertheless, that has shaped the alliances within Europe, and therefore someone living in Amsterdam is not likely to risk going to France. Sorry, somebody living in Hamburg or Amsterdam is not likely to risk going to France. But it seems that everywhere else he could have gone, he went, or is going to go to, as we will develop this. From a Jewish perspective, Amsterdam was a large city. There were about 8,000 Jews, and it was possibly the largest city Jewish population in Europe at that time. And initially, he got on well with the Sephardi rabbi, Solomon Aylon, or Ayllon, I probably pronounced it incorrectly, who had been Chacham in London. In fact, their connection was really an old one, because of the Sheilot from Sephardi communities in Amsterdam, London, and Hamburg, which the Chacham Tzvi had addressed. However, the idyllic relationship did not last long. Although the salary was exceptionally large, unsurprising given the size and wealth of the Amsterdam Jewish community, there were certain benefits that the Chacham Tzvi declined in order that he should not be swayed in his rabbinic rulings. He did not wish to be beholden to people. There were also a number of opponents. It does happen. And at one stage, the community tried to force his resignation by saying that if he returned his letter of appointment, his salary would be paid. The actual break came in 1713, after 3 years of being there. A Nehemiah Chia Chayun arrived in Amsterdam and asked permission to circulate his writings, which he had had printed in Berlin. The Chacham Tzvi had reasons to be concerned over Chayun, and there was present in Amsterdam a Meshulach, a rabbi visiting from Jerusalem, basically to collect money for the Jewish community there, who went through Chayun's writings and found that they were Sabbatean. And he alerted the Chacham Tzvi to this, and together they were basically said, Chayun cannot publish. Chayun cannot sell his books here. However, while the Chacham Tzvi, in fact, he had actually already banned Chayun and then removed the ban, and now reimposed it, Rabbi Eilon, at that stage, was supporting Chayun. And while Solomon Eilon considered himself appropriate to be on the Chacham Tzvi's level as the rabbi of the neighboring community, the Chacham Tzvi felt that his Sephardi colleague was less knowledgeable, and therefore when the Sephardi community suggested a joint investigation of Chayun's writings, that was not acceptable to the Chacham Tzvi. Life was getting very difficult. In fact, members of the Sephardi community were threatening both the Chacham Tzvi and Rabbi Chagiz with violence. And the Chacham Tzvi, in fact, both of them left Amsterdam. The Chacham Tzvi leaving his wife and children in Emden, while he went to London, where there had been an offer for him to lead, interestingly enough, this time the Sephardi community, or basically be a leader of the Sephardi community. He stayed a short while, and it's at that stage that his portrait was painted in oil. But he nevertheless did not accept the English job. However, the portrait was the advantage of his short stay. And many years later, when it was shown to his son Rabbi Yaakov Emden, Rabbi Yaakov Emden marveled at the exact likeness of his father in that portrait. Returning to his family in Emden, he travelled through Germany, staying in Hanover, Halberstadt, Berlin and Breslau. He crossed into Poland, staying at Oppatau, where he received a request to sit on a beis din in Hamburg to judge a complicated case. Finally, in 1718, he became Rabbi of Lemberg, of Lvov, returning to the Eastern Europe that his parents had left 70 years before. Lvov was possibly the second largest city in Poland in terms of Jewish population at that time. Brod was presumably the largest, and Krakow may have been the third or fourth. He was there just for a few months when he died, either in his late 50s or early 60s. He was survived by a large and growing family. He and his second wife had a number of children. I've seen something like an assumption of 14, although not all names seem to be known, but certainly it seems to have been over a dozen. The oldest daughter, Miriam, married Rabbi Aryeh Leib Lowenstamm, who himself became Rabbi of Amsterdam around 1740. In other words, about a generation after his father-in-law had left the job. And on his death in 1755 was succeeded by his son Saul, therefore a grandson of the Chacham Tzvi, who on his death in 1790 was succeeded by his son Yaakov Moshe. However, the title of the talk relates to the Chacham Tzvi not as grandfather of the chief rabbinate of Amsterdam, but of the chief rabbinate of Britain. So, back to his oldest daughter Miriam. Of course, the oldest daughter was actually the one who was killed as a baby but the daughter of the first wife. But Miriam was the oldest daughter of the second wife. Another son of Miriam and Aryeh Leib, grandson of the Chacham Tzvi, was called Tzvi Hirsch Lowenstamm or Levi. And he was finally known as Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Berlin, simply because he was Rabbi of Berlin in the latter part of his life. He was born in 1721, and he was therefore one of the first of the Chacham Tzvi's grandsons to be named Tzvi after his grandfather. And he became Rabbi of the Great Synagogue, London, around 1758, and therefore effectively British chief rabbi. In England, he was not known as Hirsch Levine, he was known as Hart Lion. Hart being an English translation of Tzvi Hirsch, and Lion relating to his father's name of Arei Leib. He had the distinction of being the only British chief rabbi who got away. Of the prime or chief rabbis Britain has had in over 300 years, from Aaron Hart to the present day, once appointed, the chief rabbi has remained in post either till death or till reaching an agreed age of retirement. Hart Lion was the one exception. He left in 1764 in his early 40s, after about half a dozen years, after having written about what a terrible place London is, and he didn't mean the weather. He was referring to the level of observance of his congregants. After he left, there was a difference of opinion as to who the next chief rabbi was. The main synagogue, the Great Synagogue, took Rabbi David Tebelev Schiff. The Hamburg Synagogue took Hart Lion's first cousin, Israel Meshulam Zalman Emden, a son of Rabbi Yaakov Emden, who himself was the eldest son of the Chacham Tzvi. And therefore, Rabbi Israel Meshulam Zalman was the rival chief rabbi until about 1780, when he returned to mainland Europe. It wasn't just London that was split. I think Portsmouth was also split as to which community recognized which chief rabbi. After he left, Rabbi David Tebelev Schiff was accepted as the rabbi of the country. And some years after he died, Solomon Herschel was chief rabbi from 1802 until his death in 1842. Now, although his name was Solomon Herschel, Herschel was simply the first name of his father, Herschel Levine, Hart Lion. He was taking on the job that his father left some almost 40 years before. Maybe he just felt that London had got bigger and slightly more religious since his father had left there. And he was therefore, of course, the great-grandson of the Chacham Tzvi, and interestingly enough, was the first chief rabbi of Britain to be actually British-born, because he had been born in London during the few years that his parents were there. With his death, the chief rabbinic connection with the Chacham Tzvi came to an end over 120 years after the Chacham Tzvi's own passing. Or did it? Note that the Chacham Tzvi's name was Tzvi. His father was Yaakov Sack. The previous chief rabbi is Yaakov Tzvi Sachs, not Yehonason. Jonathan's just his English name. Yaakov Tzvi Sachs. Now, much of this is total coincidence, as Lord Sax's surname derives from a longer surname. A few years ago, I wrote a series of articles on Jewish surnames in the Daf HaShavua. Daf HaShavua, as most of you know, is the United Synagogue in-house Shabbat newsletter. So I wrote a series of on surnames, and the first one I did was Sachs. A few months later, somebody tells me that the chief rabbi's father's surname was not Sachs. He changed it. It was something else. I forgot it. Maybe you remember, but I forgot it. So I went over to him and said, they're saying that your real family surname is such and such. He said, yes. I said, but I wrote this article about you being Sax and about Zerah Kodesh, or Saxony, being the origin of your name, and you never corrected me. Said, I like the article. So I left you alone. The Tzvi is possibly also coincidental, but Yaakov is actually a family name within the Frumkin family, within his mother's family. Aryeh Frumkin, the grandfather of Lord Sax's mother, wrote a book called Toldot Eliyahu, in which he mentioned that his father, whose name was actually Shmuel Kelmer, changing surnames just comes easily to some families, was descended through his own father from the Chacham Tzvi. However, there is no detail of the exact lineage. However, Shmuel Kelmer's wife was from a family called Brody, and a sixth-generation descendant of the eldest sister of the Chacham Tzvi's second wife. So there is a documented lineage of parent to child through 11 generations from the Chacham Tzvi's father-in-law, Rabbi Meshulam Zalman Neumark Mirels, to Chief Rabbi Sachs. Thus, even though the direct lineage is unknown, the connection to him as uncle-in-law is known. From his son Nosson, who actually became Rabbi in Brody, a great-grandson of the Chacham Tzvi was Rabbi Yaakov ben Yaakov Moshe of Lissa, born in 1760, died in 1832, who is known as either the Baal Nesivos or the Baal Chavastas, and was one of the greatest rabbis of the early 19th century. Also, in that branch of their family, the Leska and Stanislav Rebbes. Now, the Stanislav Rebbe may mean nothing to you, but some of you have met him, because in England he's known as Rabbi Uri Ashkenazi, and he is a mole who lives in Stamford Hill. He has a cousin, a Rabbi Shlomo Ashkenazi, who is head of the Boston Kollel in Har Nof, in the next door building to where we live. From the another of the Chacham Tzvi's son, David, the rabbi of a place called Yurchov, was descended a Hasidic rabbi, the Divrei Chaim of Sands, Rabbi Chaim Halberstam, from whom came many Hasidic Rebbes, including the Rebbes of Bobov and Klausenberg. From an English perspective, Bobov includes the Freshwater family. And from a Netanya perspective, the Noit Klausenberger Rebbe was the founder of the Laniado Hospital. Back to Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the oldest son of the Chacham Tzvi. The Weinberg family included Rabbi Noach Weinberg. So the Weinberg family descending from the Chacham Tzvi included Rabbi Noach Weinberg, who set up Eish HaTorah. And Reb Chuna Halpern of Golders Green was also a descendant of the Chacham Tzvi, and arranged a few years ago a republication of his ancestors' work. Now, how much longer do I have? I'll tell you what, when I see 3 or 4 of them go to sleep, I'll stop.
Please go ahead.
The Chacham Tzvi received questions and gave answers to communities and individuals from over the whole of Jewish Europe. At least 2 of these were directly related to England. The first was written in the month of Tishri in late 1693, around Sukkot time. Somebody apparently had suggested that the coastline of Great Britain, referred to in the Teshuvah as Angleterre, that coastline was a wall high enough to serve as an Eruv, and that therefore British Jewry could carry on Shabbat based solely on this natural Eruv. No need for walls or telegraph poles or anything like that. The coastline will be the Eruv. The Chacham Tzvi disagreed with this suggestion. The proposal, because as he pointed out, the proposal could just as easily be used to say that everywhere in the world is ultimately enclosed by coastlines. Because everybody wherever you live, whether you're in Africa, Asia, etc., is enclosed by coastlines. So the oceans would make all of wherever we live, islands. And if so, how could there ever have been a concept of making an Eruv anywhere? Also, halachically, an Eruv can enclose what is called a karmelis, something which the rabbis made into a public thoroughfare. But something which the Torah has made into a Reshut HaRabim, a public thoroughfare, an Eruv cannot enclose. An Eruv cannot make into a Reshut HaYachid. And although there's a different opinion as to what a Reshut HaRabim is, the general understanding is that any place where 600,000 people will congregate together is a Reshut HaRabim. And for that reason, the Eruv in London do not cover the M1. When we were recently back in Hendon, where our younger son lives, our younger son informed me, you have to walk this way, you can't walk that way, because if you walk that way, you're out of the Eruv, because it's basically the area which walks under the, where the M1, where the Great North Way goes into the M1. If you walk under there, you're out of the Eruv. So that's because the M1 is counted as a Reshut HaRabim. And the Chacham Tzvi, although at that stage he had not yet been in the British Isles, realized that there was always the possibility of so many people being congregating in an area. A side comment about this teshuvah, although at the time London was the only Jewish community in Britain, when the Chacham Tzvi responded, he wrote not only of Angleterre, but another place which he spelt Aleph Yud Samach Kaf Vav Samach Yud apostrophe Yud Aleph, which, as you know, it sounds like something like Iskosia, and is of course Scotland. And what is interesting is that this is possibly one of the very first occasions that the word Scotland was written in Hebrew, and it was at a time when at the most there would have been only a few Jews living there, and there was not yet a community. You know this story. I think it was one of the Dykuses who invented this story that Scotland was the only place in Europe that never expelled Jews. Wonderful. Scotland didn't have any Jews when all the other parts of Europe were expelling Jews.
I thought it was Ireland.
Ireland probably also didn't expel Jews, because they also didn't have Jews at the time that the places were expelling Jews.
And there were no snakes there either.
However, when asked for his opinion about the Hague, a couple of years later, the Chacham Tzvi agreed that the canal walls there created a natural Eruv. However, of course, that was a smaller area, an area where 600,000 people would not be congregating in any place, and therefore it could become the natural walls, or the natural canal walls. Do I mean natural canal walls? The canal walls would therefore be the existing Eruv. The other English question came a decade later. Chacham David Nieto, the leader of London Sephardim, had given a sermon which spoke of God being nature. To a generation of people hearing the views of contemporary scientists who believed in God but explained phenomena as being natural, Chacham Nieto explained that what was being called nature is actually God. Now, opponents of his within the community accused him of being a deist, of following the heretic Spinoza. and those and others who did not see God directing the course of the world. The lay leadership asked the Chacham Tzvi's opinion, and he said the sermon was correct and not heretical, and Chacham David Nieto stayed in Beavis Marks. One teshuva of the Chacham Tzvi that may have had limited relevance in his day, but has in recent years become a bone of contention, is his ruling regarding non-Israelis in Israel over Yom Tov. Now, you may recall a few years ago a Dayan Gershon-Lopian, the late Dayan Gershon-Lopian, giving an opinion. And basically, his opinion was based on the Chacham Tzvi. And the Chacham Tzvi said, where people are visiting Israel just for Yom Tov, and they're going back straight after Yom Tov, they live permanently outside Israel, nevertheless, they just keep one day. Right. Now, before explaining this, I need to explain the majority view. The majority view is based on a Mishnah in Pesachim. In Pesachim, we are told as follows. Everywhere in Israel, no town allowed work on Erev Pesach in the afternoon. Some towns had a custom not to allow work in the morning either, and some towns did allow work on Erev Pesach morning. And the Mishnah says that if you go from a town which works, or a town where they work on in the morning to a town where they don't, or from a town where they don't to a town where they do, you keep the chumrah, the stringency, whether of the place where you came from or the place that you have gone to, and don't make a machlokas, don't make a quarrel about this. So the majority view is that if you are coming from, let's say, England to Israel, and you're going back to England, even if you're, let's say, in yeshiva for a year or two, and you're going back to England, you have to keep second day Yom Tov, because you're keeping the stringency of the place where you are, the stringency of the place where you come from. Of course, there are difficulties in this, because when it comes to last day Yom Tov, there's a whole issue of tefillin, because the stringency of where you are means putting on tefillin, whereas the stringency of where you've come from means keeping Yom Tov. It's difficult. But that is the majority view. There are differences within the majority view which are not relevant to this talk. The Chacham Tzvi held differently. The Chacham Tzvi said that he felt that this Mishnah did not relate to this question, because he said an Israeli resident is not allowed to keep second day Yom Tov. Because, in other words, an Israeli resident can't say the brachot for the second night Seder. He can drink 4 cups of wine and so on, but he can't make the brachot that are specific to the Seder. He must put on tefillin the day after Yom Tov finishes. It's a rule we call Baal Tosif. You're not allowed to add. He cannot add. Being a person who keeps a 7-day Yom Tov, he can't keep an 8-day Yom Tov. Whereas in the example of Erev Pesach morning brought in the Mishnah, the resident of the town in question himself could, if he so wished, not work. In other words, someone who lives in an area, lives in a town where one works on, where one works on Erev Pesach in the morning, could himself decide not to work that morning, because not everybody works every day, and therefore he'd be allowed to do that. So the Chacham Tzvi ruled that the visitor to Israel keeps just 1 day Yom Tov. He does not, in other words, it's a totally different situation to the situation that the Mishnah gives. What is interesting, however, is that Chacham Tzvi did not address the issue of an Israeli visiting or living temporarily outside Israel. Now, and I have seen different opinions as to whether his view would also expect Israelis outside Israel to keep second day Yom Tov fully or not. One of the Chacham Tzvi's teshuvot is exceptionally unusual. It is unusual because nobody asked him the question. It was a question he decided to ask himself, as to whether a golem can be counted in a minyan. Okay, do any of you think a golem can be counted in a minyan?
No.
Okay, none of you think that a golem can be counted in a minyan. Why do you think that a golem cannot be counted in a minyan?
Because he's not
It's not
human.
human.
Because he's not human. Any other reason?
Hasn't got a soul.
Hasn't got a soul.
It's not
Well, you
Jewish.
already know the answer.
It's not Jewish.
He's not Jewish. Okay, you could even say something else. How do you know a golem is male? Just because he's been formed male, that doesn't make him male. I mean, can you imagine a situation? A Jewish woman can't be in a minyan, and a golem formed as a man can be. The question's obviously ridiculous. And therefore, you would assume that this was a Purim Torah. Interesting enough, the Chacham Tzvi seems to be quite serious about the question. And the reason is that whereas we would say there isn't such a thing as a golem, and there's never been such a thing as a golem, because nobody's ever made, no person has ever made a man out of dust. Frankenstein exists only in novels. And, as we just say, what makes a golem a Jew rather than a Gentile, a man rather than a lady? Of course, a lady will say the golem can't be a lady, because since a golem was also a word for fool, a golem can only be a man. However, the Chacham Tzvi can't suggest that there was never such a thing as a golem. First of all, there are Talmudic sources which mention the creation by rabbis of such beings as and when required. But second, because he himself was descended from Rabbi Eliyahu Baal Shem of Chelm, who lived from 1550 to 1583, died at the age of 33, and he created a golem. But when the golem became dangerous, he had it returned to dust. There is a story that what actually happened, that is a suggestion that what actually happened was that the golem, in getting rid of the golem hit him, and in other words, golem fell on him and killed him. It is probable that the story of the Maharal and the golem was actually taken from the Baal Shem of Chelm, because the Rabbi Eliyahu, the great-grandfather of the Chacham Tzvi, the story that he created the golem already existed within 50 years of his death, whereas it only surfaced about the Maharal over 200 years after his death. And therefore, it sounds to me like an existing story about a known figure being transferred onto a better-known figure who lived in the same period. The Maharal, because he lived to around 90, was about 30 years older than the Baal Shem of Chelm, but survived him for almost 30 years. So the Chacham Tzvi asked whether golem cannot make up a minyan because he's not Jewish, and the relevant phrase he uses is B'tok b'nei Yisrael. The relevant phrase in the Torah is V'niktashti b'tok b'nei Yisrael. I will be sanctified among the Jewish people. Therefore, and that's the basis of part of the basis of a minyan. Since a golem is not a Jew, therefore he can't be part of a minyan. But the Chacham Tzvi says, on the other hand, a person who raises an orphan is counted as having given birth to the orphan, and therefore the golem can be considered his master's child, and therefore fit to make up a minyan. His conclusion, however, was that as one can dispose of a golem without it being considered killing, a golem is not a person and does not make up a minyan. And to make up a minyan, one does not need only chiyut, life, but, as you mentioned, a nefesh and a neshama, a soul. So no golem in the minyan. However, the relevance of this teshuvah is that in the not too distant future, when robots are made to look like human beings, they will not be counted in the minyan. Rabbi Yaakov, the last position I will come to is the one that doctors are not happy with. Rabbi Yaakov Emden related that his father, the Chacham Tzvi, did not smoke on Yom Tov. There is something which maybe we don't have time to go into, which is called Shaveh L'chol Nefesh. Something to be allowed on Yom Tov, to allow using fire on Yom Tov, even from an existing flame. It has to be for something which is called Shaveh L'chol Nefesh, something which most people do. If something is a minority thing, only a few people do it, then one can't do it on Yom Tov. So the Chacham Tzvi actually, for a time, desisted from smoking on Yom Tov, until somebody said to him, "You're depriving yourself of Oneg Yom Tov, of the pleasure of Yom Tov." And so he started smoking on Yom Tov. Several people use this, and other experiences of great rabbis, in support of their smoking. Since what does a 20th century know? Since what does a 20th century doctor know when the Chacham Tzvi himself smoked? I have seen an article responding to this. Even if we were to assume that the Chacham Tzvi's medical and scientific knowledge was greater than present-day knowledge, was smoking in his day as lethal as it is now? Smoking then 40 a day just didn't happen. Smoking was probably an occasional treat. And what was in the cigarette or cigar of those times might have been healthier than what is in them now. To conclude, from the Jewish Encyclopedia, or not the Encyclopedia Judaica, the Jewish Encyclopedia from over a century ago, which you can actually see in the Wikipedia article. The Chacham Tzvi was of a firm and unselfish, but abrupt and passionate disposition. Everywhere he aroused the discontent and hatred of the rich and the scholarly. Extensive learning, keen intelligence, and exception. Sorry, I read that wrongly. Hatred of the rich. Extensive learning, keen intelligence, and exceptional linguistic attainments all combined to make him one of the most distinguished men of his day. All his contemporaries, even those who knew him only as the head of the class at Altona, unite in praising his profound learning, astuteness, clearness of exposition, which never degenerated into the subtleties of pilpul, and his absolute disregard for the influence of money. He would suffer serious deprivation rather than accept pecuniary assistance. And this characteristic, interpreted by the wealthy of that day as obstinacy and arrogance, became to him a source of much suffering and enmity.
As usual, at this point, I will invite questions from the audience, which I presume the lecturer is prepared to take. Would each questioner please identify himself or herself before actually asking the question? Gentleman there.
Yes, my name is Yehuda Abel. Do you mind if I ask from a sitting position?
Perfectly
I have
okay.
problems standing up occasionally.
You're not the only one.
I think we were in contact many years ago.
I don't know.
Okay.
No, you were in Bushy.
Yes, yes.
Our son was in Radlett.
Yes, yes. We were in contact
So
many
you know.
years ago.
My son.
Yeah. I'll tell you why afterwards.
Just a couple of incidents.
So not only have I got my former boss here, I've got the mother of a current United Synagogue rabbi, the parents of a former United Synagogue rabbi, and I'm hemmed in. Sorry.
Right, no, I read a long time ago in an article in the Encyclopedia Ligdolei Israel that the Chacham Tzvi was very dissatisfied with the arrangements for Jewish education, and he called a meeting of all the teachers in the district, I don't know how far afield, and insisted that they should teach the grammar of the Hebrew language and full text of the Torah and the Nevi'im, and that this is actually required under halacha, according to 99.99% of the poskim. But I don't think he actually got anywhere with it. I wonder if you could tell us something about that. Maybe I'm mistaken.
I'm not aware of it. I'm not surprised. It sounds like the sort of thing he might well have done, because he was his knowledge was extensive. Even his secular knowledge was quite extensive. Rabbi Yaakov Emden writes that his father, that the Chacham Tzvi would read philosophy books in the lavatory, until he then realized he had a problem because he was reading them in Hebrew. And of course, when you read philosophy in Hebrew, you start thinking, this concept, it relates to Torah. I can understand that he would have been particular about that. And certainly both he and at least Rabbi Yaakov Emden were great grammarians and linguistic scholars.
Yes. And the other thing, if you could tell us something about it, please, is the Teshuvah, which Chacham Tzvi wrote to Rav Chizkiah da Silva, to the Prach, on two items. I can't remember what the two were. One of them, I have a vague recollection. Anyhow, the Chacham Tzvi wrote to him, Hitarta et ha'asur va'asarta et ha'mutar. He claimed that what he had said is forbidden should be permitted, and what the Parach said.
I'm not sure which Teshuvah that is.
One of the questions was
I'll have to look.
keeping food hot in a sealed oven and breaking the seal on Shabbat, and the other one I can't remember what it was.
I'll have to look that up.
Right. Okay.
Fortunately, in the two volumes, the second volume. Is it the second volume? No. I think no. I think it's the end of the additions at the end of the first volume to the newest print. I think has quite a lot. Has quite a lot of information.
Another question? My. Donia.
Donia Meir. I was just thinking, when he was in Salonika, he must have met the large community of Sabbateans there. Do we know anything about that? Did he write anything about that? Did he have any contact with them?
My guess is any contact he had with Sabbateans would have been negative contact.
Yeah.
In other words, the people he would have been with would have been against the Sabbateans. As I already mentioned, Rabbi Yaakov Emden says that that his father considered the bracha v'lam malshinim within, which of course was created centuries before, but in his period of time to relate to the Sabbateans. He had seen the devastation that they caused to European Jewry. Yeah. So it's separate to his feeling that they were religiously wrong. He had seen the negative impact of their behaviour. In fact, that's something I hadn't mentioned. I mentioned about those who followed Shabtai Tzvi into Islam, but a number of people in disappointment of what had happened actually just left Judaism for Christianity.
Yes.
So it was the fallout from the events of 1666 were tremendously bad for the Jewish world.
The Frankists.
Yeah. Well, Frankist actually is after the Chacham Tzvi's life. That's already in the time of his sons. But because I think Dietrich Frank only comes to prominence after Chacham Tzvi dies.
They try to keep our foot in both camps. Any more questions? in that case I'll just make a contribution of my own. Many, many years ago, in the days of national service in Britain, I served in the Royal Air Force in Germany in the what was called Signals and Intelligence Department in Hamburg, or in the region of Hamburg. And to while away time, I used to look for something to read, since I spoke German, and I found a novel by a Jewish writer, for whom I was not particularly familiar in those days, named Leon Feuchtwanger. The novel was in German, Jud Süß, Jew Süß. Later, of course, vilified or transformed into a violently anti-Semitic film by Weithalen in the Nazi period. But the novel itself is fascinating because of the historical detail. Feuchtwanger, who grew up in an Orthodox family in Bavaria, was able to supply, and it includes very interesting dialogues, contacts between Rabbi Yaakov Emden and Rabbi Jonathan Eibeschutz. And this was the first I knew about it. It started me looking further. So it just shows you that sometimes literature can also be a source of information about this sort of thing. Any more questions? If not, I would like to call upon your former boss, Mr. Peter Sheldon, whom I knew about 150 years ago as Peter Schuldenfly. And not only him, I knew his late brother Jack and his brother Yossel. We'll talk about that afterwards. Would you please give us your thanks?
Ladies and gentlemen, it's my great pleasure, in one sense, to offer this vote of thanks. I've been waiting to get my own back. Nigh on 20 years. Rabbi Salasnik and I never had a boss and employee relationship. We were colleagues together in the same organization. But not only was he an extraordinary mishpachologist, but he used to, every year on Purim, take the opportunity to take the mickey out of the people that were running the organization that I had the pleasure to head. And I was very often the butt of his Purim humor. I have no intention of making the butt of my humor. I don't have much humor in any event. Nevertheless, I have looked forward to this moment for a long, long time. Rabbi Salasnik, your story of the Hacham Sivi today reminds me of the fact that whenever I walk around in ancient places, old cities, I marvel at the fact of the knowledge that those people had at that time, hundreds of years ago, sometimes even thousands of years ago, the abilities and the knowledge of those people. And you've brought to life today for us the amazing life of this individual of whom I knew very little. I now know very much more, and the times in which he lived. And it was fascinating, it was interesting. You brought to it your usual wonderful delivery and underlying sense of humour, and all the other qualities which you enumerated when you left the rabbinate and have been, again, vividly demonstrated this evening. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you very much for giving us the benefit of your knowledge, wisdom, erudition, and sheer good humour. And we look forward to hearing from you again sometime in the future.
Exactly. Right. Announcements as usual. If you're not on our mailing list but would like to